All right, welcome. Thanks everyone for giving up a little bit of lunchtime or whatever time to to listen to me rattle on. Um, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we're standing on today. Um, and look, we've got 20 minutes, 30 minutes at most, so there's only so much we can cover, isn't there, in that time. Uh, my intention here is not to have everyone walk away, having learned all that I have learned about facilitation, but I just thought I'd focus on a couple of things that feel useful to me. One idea in particular, I know you have all your own experience, and in some of this stuff, it's you're probably very comfortable, but it's often useful to be reminded. And I hope to leave a bit of time at the end for some questions and some conversation. I'm as interested in your experience as hearing myself speak all day. So I'll just keep letting people in. And while I'm doing that, I've got a few slides. I'm just going to talk through a couple of slides this morning, if that's more this afternoon, if that's all right. So I'll just share my screen. It's very nice to have a number of people joining. I'm very grateful that you've given up your time for this. Okay, so hopefully you can see some slides, and if I pop that onto presenter mode, right, how's that looking? You're good at your end? Excellent. Okay. All right, so as I say, we're not going to cover the encyclopedia of facilitation in 30 minutes, but I just want to focus on one or two little things that, again, I found useful and important in my practice, things that I carry all the time, in fact. So what is that? Well, it's really about control and about being the expert in the room. I used to think when I started facilitating sort of 20 years ago, I guess, that that meant I had to be in charge, that I had to have magic in my fingers. Surely my fingers are magic. There's certainly what clients expect. They get a facilitator. Surely you can fix that or do that. After a while, I learned that actually I can't wave my fingers and ensure that people do what I want them to do. And it turns out they've actually got their own free will. Who'd have thought? And my fantasy that I'm in control and I can control is, well, it couldn't last, could it? And it didn't last. I guess I realized that I'm sure you've all had experience to back this up, that results when we're facilitating come from sharing power and sharing control. So I'm just going to share a couple of my stories about what that looks like to share power and control. And from two contexts, from the sense of how do I bring that thinking, sharing power and control with my participants? How do I bring that thinking before I get in the room? How do I share control and power before I get there? And how do I do it in the moment when we are in the room? So a couple of stories around each of those scenarios. It's as simple as that today. So before we get in the room, I guess the concept, and it's a familiar concept to all of us, is co-design. But here I'm not talking co-design, a big co-design project. What I'm talking about is how do I bring a co-mindset to my planning of my facilitation? How do I bring that lens of co together into all my work as a facilitator? And I learnt the power of this a sort of key moment, and some of you might have heard this story before, when I was rung by local council some years ago, 10 years ago, and they said, oh, well, that contentious development up in the northern suburbs, well, it's happening, and we've got to have a public meeting about it next week. And it had been in the local papers for weeks, months, years even, very hot button set of issues. So we knew it was going to be a contentious and difficult meeting. So really they were asking me on the phone, can you manage an angry meeting? They didn't say that in so many words, but that was the subtext. And, you know, have you got magic fingers that can make people behave themselves in a room? And by that stage, I'd learnt that, well, sadly, my fingers have run out of magic, but what else can I do? And how do I let go and share? In that context, this thing was just days away. I didn't know anything about it really, except what I'd read in the paper. And I didn't know, you know, I had to run this thing. So how do I code that? Well, I asked council if there were some key players, some key stakeholders, and yes, there were. Can I have the phone number? And yes, I could. So I just rang a few people, 4 or 5 locals. Hi, I'm Stuart Waters. You know, I'll be facilitating next week's meeting. I guess you'll be there. Oh, you're darn right, I'll be there. And I imagine we're expecting a bit of passion. What do you think? Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, people are really upset. And then we talked about that. And so the co-part was, well, how do you think I should manage that? What would you do in that meeting if the agenda's kind of this sort of thing? What would you do? What's your advice about how I might run that? And what would a good outcome look like from your perspective? And if the agenda is this, how does that feel? Are there any gaps in that? You know, just basic, obvious questions, but if I did that for 3 or 4 people and, you know, just got some tips and some input. And in fact, none of that input really changed what I was going to do. It was, you know, make sure we have a say and make sure everyone's heard and make sure things are recorded. And, you know, people didn't really have a clear answer to all of those questions. But that was the least important part of it. I think the most important part was that they were being asked. And here was the facilitator. Really, I was saying, I don't know how best to run that meeting next week, and I really need your help. And so on the day, I was able then to actually greet them. Oh, hi, Tony. I spoke to you last week. That was great. And thanks for that input. And then at the front of the room, I was able to say, and you know, I've been able to speak to a few people and got some suggestions about tonight, and I really appreciate that. So again, I was letting go and I was demonstrating that I'm not the boss. I'm not the boss of this. That this is your meeting. It's a line I keep saying. And all I've done is talk to some people to help make this as useful as possible. I didn't make that public meeting not angry, of course, but it helped. And it was my attempt to let go and to share control, even under that quite constrained situation where it was a public meeting, you know, a hearing, particular agenda, and there was lots of constraints around that. So that's a story from some years ago, and it was quite important to me, quite useful. And I guess I'm bringing that thinking to some current work, actually, which is state government client. They've got to work with 2 stakeholders, 2 organisations, 2 volunteer organisations, and they've got some agreements around funding for projects. And the department came to me a month or 2 ago and said, we want to run a workshop with these 2 just to finalise some project plans, not quite as we would like them. And so we want to get people in the room and do that together. You know, well-intentioned, all good. And yeah, sure. Can you design a workshop to do that? Yes, of course. And so I was doing that. And then I sort of took that other story to heart and said, I'm going to speak to these people. So I rang them up, both organizations, and there was lots of confusion. Dropped my earpiece. Lots of confusion about that, about why are we doing this and what would be the outcome, and all sorts of issues and questions. And in the end, it became clear that having another workshop, that's so difficult for us. We've got to get our people from far and wide, and we're working full time. We have to take time off, and it became quite problematic pretty quickly. And so, of course, the question then is, what's going to work better? And again, you know, it's a simple and obvious example, but as a facilitator, I could have invested all my time in planning an agenda that optimally manages that workshop. Could people maybe just make sure microphones are off if there's a bit of background noise? But I guess I chose, in addition, to to share a bit of control, and I learned something really important. And in the end, we're going to this week hold some meetings on Teams instead of trying to get everyone together. So it's a good example for me of how well-intentioned we are. Let's get people in the room and have a workshop, because that's collaborative and good and positive, always useful. And yes, but it's very easy to get in our collaboration steamroller and drive our process over our stakeholders. And that's the co-lens. So let's get out of our steamroller and let's actually talk to people and say, and talk about what's going to work. So a couple of examples of how I bring co into the event before the event as a facilitator. And again, I'm sure you have your own stories about this. And it would be useful, I think, for all of us, and I try and do this, to reflect on some of these questions. So where am I at risk of driving my steamroller over stakeholders? And in this current project, I was at high risk of doing that. You're going to come to a workshop. And so I try to model good collaboration by letting go. And I try to do that in the planning. And whether that's a team meeting tomorrow, around the desk in the office, or whether it's with 100 stakeholders in a month, I think this principle applies. How do I signal that they matter and that I want their fingerprints on the process, instead of relying on me and my expert magic fingers, which are a fantasy anyway. All right. So what about in the room? A couple of stories here. I used to do a lot of training, and as the trainer, of course, you are the expert in the room, aren't you? And you're trained to get there and to get set up and provide that training environment and be that expert and share the knowledge and be that person at the front of the room. And I used to make sure I was there and get the room set up and get the things out and lay all the stuff out on the tables and all that sort of trainery stuff. And as a facilitator, I would do the same thing. But really, I wonder whether being that expert and in control is always the right signal to be sending as a facilitator. And I wonder whether there are risks to getting a good outcome if I'm looking like that expert and in complete control. I see some risks around that. People deferring to my view. The more I look like the expert around here, of course, the more they will defer to my view. And the more I'm modeling that expertise is what matters here, not difference and diversity. They will cede accountability for outcomes to me, won't they? The more I look like I know what I'm doing and I'm the guy who delivers outcomes, the more everyone else can relax and sit back and go, oh, that bloke with the microphone in the front of the room, he looks like he'll deliver for us. And I'm really modeling that somehow I know the answers to everything. Yeah, I know how to do this. I know how to set this up. I know your needs today. And we all conspire in that fantasy that I know your needs today, and I'm the bloke who sets it up for success. And there's, of course, elements of truth in that. I've been around long enough to know what's necessary, but I like to play with different. What does different look like? Well, I try and play with being a bit more relaxed. And that doesn't mean looking unprofessional or unprepared or out of control, but it means being more inclusive and ceding some of that control to the group in the room. I don't always necessarily set the whole room up perfectly so people walk in and there I am already. I might wait and talk to people. So here's what I'm thinking about room setup today. We're going to be doing this over here. What do you think? Where do you think we need to set the tables? How many around each table? What does that look like, do you reckon? What's going to make you comfortable? These are all just little tiny things, but I think they're important signals. And this is your workshop, not my workshop. So why would I know? And maybe you could give me a hand doing this and let's try that. Oh yeah, that works. Just as people sort of trickle in, this is kind of how I sometimes play this. And again, whether I'm in a great big workshop or a little team meeting in the office, I guess I can choose the extent to which I'm exuding, I'm the expert, this is my show, or sending the signal that, oh, this is your show, folks, and I'm here to help. And so anything I can do around that, I find useful. So yeah, let's, that's right. I wasn't ready to move on yet. I had another story to share. And this one, again, about in the room, quite a different sort of moment, again, a formative experience. And some of you who've come to these workshops might have heard this one before, but the angriest public meeting I've ever been to, 200 people, 300 people, I don't know, we lost count, standing room only, they were queuing up. We knew it was going to be angry, and it was for transport, and it was a little rural community about chopping down their beloved forest, or some of their trees in their beloved forest for a road project. And there was real anger. And so, I'd spent all this time preparing my agenda and my process as the magic facilitator. We'll do this, and that'll make them, that'll enable them to be heard. We'll do this, and then that'll share information. Then we'll do this and this and this. It was a great plan. And, that's what the client thought they were paying me for, the great plan that was going to work. And of course, I get in the room, and the first thing I say was, oh, it's a great plan. And everyone's got a bit of paper on their chair and a pencil. I want us all to just write down that key burning issue for you. And I copped a whole swag of abuse and was told in very short order what a stupid idea that was. And okay, all right, that's clearly not going to fly. The roof nearly came off the place. So plan B. All right, well, plan B, the next thing on my agenda was client transport's going to show a few slides and talk us through what's happening. Now, again, more abuse, more aspersions cast on my character, in words of 4 letters. And the TV camera was there too. And every time they yelled at me, the cameraman was there in the face, and the sweat's running down. And so I needed a plan C, and I didn't have a plan C. I had no plan C. I didn't know what to do next. And so what I did next was, in front of 300 angry people and all the project people lined up behind me in their chairs looking at me, magic facilitator, I said, all right, so what do you think needs to happen? What do you want to happen next? And it turns out what they wanted to happen next was that their little community group had created their own slides, their own presentation, and they marched up with their stick and stuck it in the computer, and they showed the presentation, which then allowed transport to show their presentation. And then we went into question and answer, and the meeting proceeded. My key takeaway from that was, it was the moment when I didn't know what to do that allowed us to make progress. It was the moment when I said, what do you need? When my magic fingers, disappeared, when all my preparation was tossed out the window, it was that moment that actually allowed progress and enabled the group to work towards what they wanted. And there's something important there, isn't there? All that careful planning I've done as the expert facilitator, and actually all I had to do was say, what do you need to do? And I'm not saying we never need to plan, but I'm saying that thinking actually is quite important. And the other thing that followed that, the question and answer, we had 300 people in the room. And how do you manage 300 people in an angry public meeting who all want to say something? And this was another moment. Fortunately, someone had given me some great advice just before this, about stacking and tracking. Some of you might do this, and it saved my bacon, saved the room actually that night. It was, all right, we're now going to go into Q&A, and how many in this room are going to want to say something? And of course, every hand shot up. Everyone wanted to have a spray at transport and at me and at whatever. And it was at that point quite obvious to the room, to me, to everyone, that all right, there's a lot of us who want to say something. And I said, folks, I'm going to need your help to manage this. I promise we're going to stay until we've all had a say. I promise that. But if we don't want to be here till 1 a.m., we're going to need to manage that together, aren't we? And that means keeping it short. So, I made the problem obvious. My dilemma as a facilitator, I can't do this without your help. And then to sort of help bring them into sharing accountability for how the meeting ran, I use that stacking and tracking process. Well, all right, so I'm going to start here at the front row on the left-hand side. Everyone was seated in 3 rows. And I'll work my way back. I promise I will get to you all. I will start at the front and do the first row, second row, third row. So there's no need to sit there with your hand raised. And that again brought everyone into helping me manage it, because if they'd already had a say, they recognized it was someone else's turn. It was, we'd moved on and someone else needed to go. And it just meant everyone was helping each other manage the room and manage the dynamics and hear each other. And again, it was a great lesson in, I'm not the boss here. I'm just helping people with some structure, and they're doing it themselves, really. And I walked away from that meeting, well, firstly glad to be alive, and secondly with a whole lot of thoughts about what worked in that event. It was really quite a formative process for me. Letting go, sharing control, inviting the room in to help me manage. This is stuff we all know intellectually as facilitators, but that was what it actually looks like in the moment. And I take from that, these questions really, how can I bring this approach into my facilitation all the time? How can I cede control? How do I let go? How do I invite in? How do I not be the expert at the front of the room who everyone looks to? And yeah, what does letting go look like? All right, well, we've probably got time for a couple of questions if anyone has any, or comments, or your own stories, whatever. But before you do, one of the things there seems to have been some interest in this. There's a bunch of people signed up. They're not all online right now. And I wondered whether there's actually an opportunity to do a couple of sessions around this. So I'm flagging a program, just sort of this sort of format for an hour, 6 weeks in a row, and stay tuned for some info about that. But I'd be interested in any sense of, yes, that feels useful. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Stay tuned for that. I'll send you the recording and other details about that. All right, I wonder if anyone, just in the few minutes left, anyone has a story or a question or comment on any of that. I'm interested in how you're sharing control. I can see a couple of things happening in the chat. So Ben just asked about stacking and tracking, and thanks, Ben. It is one for big meetings where I just think it's fabulous. Again, just to reiterate, who's going to make it public? Who wants to say something? Put your hand up. Okay, we can all have a look around. Okay, there's 100 of us who want to say something. That's good. I'm going to start here, and however your room is set up, this table, I'll work my way back. And it's just giving people a map of where we will get to, a structure. And what I find is, how at a badly run public meeting, people are leaping in to be heard, and they have to sort of fight. And there's a lot of tension about, I'm not getting an opportunity. Some people are good at leaping in and being heard. Most of us probably aren't. So this is a way to equalize that, and it just takes a lot of that heat out and the stress out. We can all relax because I'm getting to you, and when I'm going to get to you. I'm going to get to you when I've done that table and that table.
So it just lets everyone know there's 100 other people that have, okay.
Yeah.
And what's the tracking bit?
The tracking is really it's just keeping account of where you are,
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
in that
Yep.
process. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, any other thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions? Okay. All right. Well, look at that. Remarkable. Yeah, there's a raised hand. Tommy.
Hello, thank you for that. Sorry, I was a bit late to join. I just wondered when you're doing that process where you're stacking and tracking and listening to everyone and making sure that you record them, um, what do you do with recording after? Do you summarize it and offer it back out to people and give them another opportunity to contribute further?
Yeah, look, that's a good question and a great suggestion I hear in there. I think it's really context dependent, isn't it? Sometimes it's just all we're doing is in the room having that conversation with the, between like the project people and the people. We're just asking questions and getting some answers, and that's all we need to do. Other times there's, formal recording needs to happen. I would say that's context dependent. But of course, the starting position always is close the loop, isn't it? Be visibly capturing people's words and closing the loop either in the moment in that workshop or post the event. But yeah, I hope it's not a cop out to say I think there's a lot of context in that question and how I would manage that, Tommy.
No, that's good. Thank you. I've just had some times when people want to do, Chatham House rules and they don't want it to leave the meeting. And then other times where people expect minutes and just
Mm,
wondering which is, how do you navigate that? You just listen and respond accordingly. And as you said,
yes.
context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Look, I think they're all important questions, aren't they? And I would have those questions, ideally before the event with as many people as maybe I can talk to, or certainly at the start, get some agreement around like Chatham House rules, for example. That's an important one. Okay, folks. By my clock, you're about to stop listening to me. So I hope that added some value over your lunch times. And yeah, thanks for joining. It's nice to be talking to some faces and not a blank screen. And yeah, I'll send out the recording and a couple of little resources perhaps. And I'll see you. Thanks.